This podcast and every other podcast I make is supported by Patreon. If you want to throw the Patreon $1, you'd be helping to support these relatively niche shows that I intend to be very educational and informative about the games industry, talking to a lot of very cool people. But there are other memberships that include some special bonuses too, such as completely unedited Q&As, ad-free versions of content, unedited versions of shows, and even the ability to play games with me. So if you want to support some independent games industry podcasts, check out the link in the description. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Video Game Writing 101. Today I am joined by Gary Whitta. Gary, who are you and what do you do?
Is that how you start everyone?
Pretty much,
is that your bogus question?
Oh, it makes it so much easier. I don't have to introduce you.
No, it's good. It's good. You threw it to me right away. I'm a former video game journalist. I started out many years ago as editor-in-chief of PC Gamer magazine. That's what brought me here to the United States. And for the last, I want to say 20 years, I have been a screenwriter in Hollywood, working primarily in film and television, but also in video games. I also do comic books. I'm a novelist. I do all kinds of writing, mostly film and television. But because I had a whole career prior to my Hollywood career as a video game writer, and because video games, as we know in Hollywood, are so the Venn diagram is practically a circle at this point. There's a lot of crossover stuff in the work that I do.
You are one of the only guests I've had. The other one was Mitch Dyer, who came from a press background, like me. People ask me questions about it all the time, but I feel like I can't answer as effectively as you might be able to. What do you think are some of the biggest differences between writing press and screenwriting, and do you think those skills are transferable?
Not really. I mean, I think you can draw. I mean, I think as a critic, as a journalist, you're mostly writing kind of like essays, I guess, and critiques and things like that. It's very different. Nonfiction, fiction, obviously very different. I didn't find the skills to be transferable at all. I worked as a games journalist and a writer, and also as a film critic. I edited a film magazine for some years, even a sports magazine for some years before I moved into Hollywood. And I didn't find, I mean, obviously, I think writing's writing, like you learn grammar and how to construct a sentence and things like that. And I guess there's an argument that when you write an essay, especially like a long form essay, you are telling a story, right? There's a structure to like a long read essay. And so I think there are kind of like maybe some very, very basic universal rules about like what good writing is and isn't in terms of how you engage a reader, get them, excited right away and get them, to read all the way to the end. That's true no matter what you're writing. But beyond that, I think they separate very quickly, and the rules of and the things that you're concerned with when you're writing fiction, I think, are very, very different.
I agree with that, but I think I might have found them to be more transferable than you did, and I think it was more because I've also been writing fiction my whole life. Like that's where I started before I did journalism, and then got back into fiction.
Yeah, me too.
That probably makes sense. Like I was writing short stories as a kid and all that.
Yeah, that's what I did. I used to get bullied at school because I used to play. It's funny how it turned out as a video game writer. I would play video games back in the 80s when I was a kid, when games didn't really have much of a story. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Mario, the princess is in another castle. Like that was video game story back in the day, and we were okay with it. And I would play these games that didn't really have much of a story, basically what would fit on the back of like the cassette inlay. That's how old I am. I used to play games that came on tape cassette that you would load. And so I would kind of write the story in my head. I would do my own headcanon version and fill out the story.
You're writing fanfic.
I would write fanfic in my head, and I used to write my own little fanfic versions of like Infocom games and things like that. And
I wrote Jet Force Gemini fanfic. I could probably still find that.
I've still got the very, very first screenplay I ever wrote back in 1988 that was based on a 1985 Commodore 64 game called Paradroid. It's on this old yellowed, dog-eared paper. I look at it now and I cringe, but like for me, it's a historical artifact. Yeah. The first screenplay I ever wrote. But yeah, that's how I got started, was writing video game fan fiction, and you too. And now look at us.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
everybody starts somewhere. But I think the things that I found transferable were things that make a good journalist, I think, are not that different to things that make a good video game writer. At least I know, like, having written a few screenplays, they are, well, maybe I do write them all the same way. A lot of it is a lot more technical than I think people think. So a lot of, like, structuring an essay, as you said, for journalism is prioritizing what's important to the reader and what order the information comes in. And I think video games and, again, less so screenplays come in the same way, where it's a lot of prioritizing. It's making sure that every single line is relevant to the previous line, is relevant to a line that's going to happen 10 beats down. Where I think if you aren't a writer, you'd have to throw to the audience for this. You think that you're just sort of creatively flowing. And I'm like, I don't do very much of that. I do a lot of planning and a lot of like reading a line and making sure that it's exactly the way that character would say it. Why would this character use this word? How do they phrase this thing? Do they use these kinds of phrases? Which I didn't feel was super dissimilar to journalism, though the point, obviously, and the purpose are extremely different. Coming from that, if you started out in fanfic, writing screenplays, fanfic is a very dismissive way of putting it, but again,
but that's exactly what it was back in the day.
What made you get into journalism in the first place?
I was a video game nerd, as I said, and I would write these kind of headcanon fanfic video game stories. I grew up in the UK playing Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum games. As you know, in your kind of path of how you kind of go up through the different game machines through the 80s and 90s, different in the UK than I know. It's fascinating to know what it was like in Australia growing up, because in the UK, like we didn't, the Nintendo and the Sega Master System and the Super Nintendo, those things existed, but like most kids of the 80s learned to play games on the Commodore 64 or the ZX Spectrum.
I wasn't alive
rather
in
than
the
on the
80s,
game
Gary.
consoles.
I can't tell you. I wasn't alive in the 80s.
So sorry, I didn't mean to age you up to my degree, but what were your game systems when you were a kid?
Yeah, Nintendo was huge. But it's interesting if you look at the release date of a lot of 64 games. They're different in Australia. Australia had later releases than even North America in a lot of cases. I think the 64 even came out later in Australia, so we were delayed on a lot of things.
You guys got everything late.
Yeah, pretty much. We don't need more.
And overpriced as well, right? Australian game prices are a joke.
It's $110, $120, a lot of money. That said, everybody earns more money, so it kind of balances out.
All right.
Like I was at we start working at 9 months in Australia. I was at McDonald's. I don't know why it's 9 months. It's like they account for the time in the womb. Legally,
that's like when you can legally take a
13 and 9 months. Yeah, so I started straight away at McDonald's, and I think I was like my first job getting like $10.
I want to do a whole podcast that's just about. I obviously we're not going to do this, but I just want to have a whole conversation about you working at McDonald's when you were 14 years old.
Yeah, great time. It was fun.
I feel like you must have stories.
I worked the drive-through for the most part, and somebody threw a milkshake at me once. That was my most defining day. They bought it. I don't even remember why they were mad. Maybe their card declined and I had to take a different card or something. So they got it, and then they drove back around through the drive-through, threw it at me.
Oh my god!
It's a lot of effort for a thing you bought. Maybe they didn't like it. I don't remember. But
did you build the Big Macs, or did you just bag them up?
I never worked in the kitchen. I was either checkout on the front. I did a lot of cleaning. Did clean up a lot of vomit, and I do think that it defines you as a person. If you haven't worked retail and cleaned up vomit, I don't think you should be a writer. You got to have that experience. It makes writing more interesting. Okay, you can't Can you imagine people like who just write and that's all they've ever done? Like rich kids?
No,
what
you have to have some life experience to draw on. Otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah, you have to be able to relate to somebody about something. And then I did the drive-through, so I was just taking the orders, which I actually really enjoyed doing.
You had the little headset thing.
Yeah, and I would sit there and organize when there was no one there. Organize all of the money so that all of like Australian money has like a little window on it. All the windows were the same. It was the most boring thing in the world to just because I had nothing else to do while I was sitting there. In any case, that's where I came from. And now this podcast is about McDonald's. Yeah, you start working at.
Sorry, I have a terrible habit of like derailing conversations.
It's fine. This is supposed to be more like getting a coffee with someone than it is like an interview, so it works. But
well, we're certainly doing that. Yes. So but I'm going to get us back on track to answer your question. I grew up playing video game, computer games. I was obsessed with them. And initially I wanted to make them. Again, I come from a generation where computer games used to be made by one person. Like one person could program a Commodore 64 or a Spectrum game, right? It was just one person that did everything because the games were so basic. You know, you didn't really, maybe two people, but it was like there were a lot of the game creators that were like famous of that period. It's not teams, it's one person. Now, of course, obviously it's massive teams. There's still, occasionally now you have like an indie game that breaks through if like one or two people made it, like Vampire Survivors, right? One guy, right?
Wait,
amazing.
Really?
Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. Isn't that crazy? That's
super impressive.
That's my favorite. Awesome. That was my game of the year for last year,
it's
Vampire Survivors.
Game. Wow.
Oh, it's just the best.
Damn.
And so I wanted to make games. I wanted to program and design my own games. And I bought a book on assembly language and machine code because that's what you would use to make these games. And I very, very quickly realized that I'm very, very right-brained, which is, the right brain is the creative half, and the left half is the left side's the rational kind of half. So, like, for example, I'm very, very good with imaginative things and abstract concepts, but like logic and puzzles and things like that and math, I can't do. Like when my wife and I play. I remember when I was playing Uncharted a couple of years ago, the more recent one, and I would do all the scaling and the combat. And when we would get to a puzzle, I would give the controller to my wife, and she would solve the puzzle for me. I'm fascinated by logic and puzzles. Like I'm fascinated by mathematics. I'm fascinated by chess and things like that. But I can't actually do it.
Same.
And maybe the reason why I'm fascinated is because I know it's impenetrable to me. But I'm very good with abstract, imaginative type things. And so what I realized was, okay, so that's never going to work because I'm just not technically minded. And so I thought, but I used to be obsessed with video game magazines. I grew up on this magazine called Zap 64, which was like the predominant Commodore 64 magazine of the 1980s. And I wanted to review, I thought I could review the games, I could write about them. I am good at writing. I knew that was like English was the only class in school that I was ever interested in. I would write my little sad fan fictions and things like that. And like it was the only school report I ever got back. Like, oh, Gary's a really good writer. And so I thought, well, maybe I could review the games and write about them. Maybe I could get a job on a magazine. Now, don't forget, this is all pre-internet. This is just print is the only thing. There's no easy way in.
My first writing job was print.
Yeah,
still happens.
I mean, yeah, we're both old school to different degrees. And I remember distinctly sitting in my parents' kitchen with an old typewriter and typing out a mock review of a game called International Karate that I was a big fan of, and I put it in envelopes and I sent it off to Commodore User and Zap 64 and CVG magazine and different places, and one of the places responded. And 15 years old, I got a job right out of school as a freelance game reviewer for a magazine called Commodore User, and that was my first foot in the door. And then that turned into a whole. I was literally doing my exams. In the afternoon, I would do my GCSEs. It was a general certificate of secondary education. I would do my kind of high school exams at 15 years old in the morning, and then the afternoon I would go to the Commodore User offices, and they would give me games to bring home and review.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And then the minute because I hated school, hated it.
Yeah.
Primarily for two reasons. A, I'm very autodidactic, which means I don't do well in structured learning environments. You can't teach me anything. I'd much rather learn it. I learn by doing and failure and experimentation, which is why I've never been good at like reading books on screenwriting or going to seminars and things like that. It all, when I go to one of those places, like the person trying to teach me just ends up sounding like the teacher from the Peanuts cartoon. I don't absorb any of it.
Sure.
But I learned just by, well, that didn't work, let's try something else. And you kind of do it the old-fashioned way. And also because I was bullied terribly in school, because I was a nerd before it was fashionable to be a nerd. I was really skinny. I had terrible acne. I had no confidence. I was into Star Wars and Star Trek and Marvel and DC and all this kind of stuff. And that's cool now, right? But like it wasn't when I was a kid, and I got beat up. And I remember one time somebody smash the wheel on my bike that I would drive to school because I was a nerd and this kind of stuff. And to this day, you'll notice in my writing to this day, like bullying and standing up to bullies is a big theme in my writing. Like even Rogue One to me is a story about standing up to bullies. Like what is the Empire if nothing but a big bully?
Sure.
It's more like the little guy stands up to, right? The rebellion.
Can I ask you a side question real quick?
Yeah.
That's I've always wanted to ask because it's always confused me. So Star Wars was already cool when I was in school. I was born in 1993. Star Wars was already
It was never not cool.
That was my question, is because Star Wars, we talk about the Star Wars nerd being bullied, but Star Wars was like one of the highest grossing film releases and has made more money than almost anything else, even from day one. I get Star Trek. How was Star Wars not cool when it was always that popular?
I don't think it was just one component of the many of the nerdy things, because and video games were cool, right? I was into video games. Video games have always been cool with kids. They've never been uncool. But I don't know.
Girls bullied me for playing video games in high school, and that happened even
well, again, the rules are different for you, right? Unfortunately, again,
sure.
Because there's a double standard in effect. But no, it was a number of things. My nerdiness being just one of them, and I think I was just one of those. I was just a spotty, skinny, gangly, awkward kid that the other kids thought it was fun to pick on. But the nerdiness was definitely one aspect of it. And so so you'll see that like Gundog, the podcast that I just did last year, is absolutely big. Like literally the book comes out in July, and the dedication on the front page says, "Dedicated to my parents who taught me to stand up to bullies." Like that whole thing is about that. And I can't even watch scenes in movies and television shows when a kid's getting bullied. Like I get very triggered by it because it's like a deep-seated thing with me. And I won't. And now, and because of that, now I've almost overcompensated as an adult. And I often have a very combative and volatile personality because, like, I decided a long time ago that I would not take any shit from anyone ever. And so, like, I often get into trouble because I push back on people like too much.
At least you know yourself.
What's that?
At least you know yourself. You know what's
and I'd rather do that than roll over and take a bunch of shit from people. But it took a long time to get there, and there's a lot of kind of all of that. There's like trauma underneath all of that. This is getting pretty deep. Do you always get this deep? Do you get this psychological?
Sometimes.
I feel like I'm talking to my therapist right now. I'm
the opposite. I let people treat me like crap, but I don't even really know.
No, you don't.
Oh, I do. I let people treat me like absolute shit, and I'm always like, oh, maybe they were having a bad day. Like, that's what I'm like in the real world, at least. It's a problem.
Really? Because you strike me as someone, I mean, I don't know you terribly well, but in the time that I've known you, you strike me as one of those people that doesn't take shit from anyone.
Yeah, I take a lot of shit. Because I'm unaffected by a lot of shit, though. You can treat me terribly, and I'll be like...
Oh, it's just going to let rolls off you?
Pretty much. And thus I let people repeatedly treat me like shit, and I go, oh... But maybe they were having a bad time.
I mean, I always try to remember that, the thing they say about like everyone that you meet is fighting a battle that you know nothing about, and you try to, take that into consideration.
Yeah.
But honestly, that only goes so far. Sometimes a dickhead is just a dickhead.
Yes.
And, they deserve to be called out. Where were we? Bring us back.
How did you get into writing in the first place, which we did cover as a 15-year-old?
So the way that my birthday fell and the way that the schooling system works in the UK, or at least used to, I don't know if it's still now that way now, but in the 1980s, your primary education ended at 16, and then if you chose to, you could do 2 extra years to get what are called your A levels, and you go from 16 to 18. You do another level of education, and then after that, if you choose to, you go to university. But in the UK, and again, maybe it's changed, but when I was a kid, there is nothing like the stigma. I don't know if it's a stigma, but there's an expectation in the US that you go to college, right? And if you don't, you're somehow
it's like that
a failure or a dropout or not fully educated.
Yeah.
And every time I've ever had to fill out a form that, an American form that says, what's your level of education? It just says like high school.
Did that make getting a visa harder?
No, because, well, I mean, okay, let's have this conversation. This is fascinating as well. I always thought this was backwards. So to get my visa back in the day, you had to have either 4 years of college or 12 years of practical experience in the relevant field. And I always thought that should be reversed, because to me, the practical experience is worth more than the college.
I would agree. I had 4 years of university, and I would have had 6 years practical experience at that point. I think
college can prepare you for certain things, but it doesn't really prepare you for the real world. I think it prepares you to socialize. There is like an academic education that you get, but like once you actually get thrown into the labor force and like the real world hits you, I don't know how well college really prepares you.
I was studying at university, my bachelor's. I majored in entertainment writing, which is the screenwriting part of everything, and journalism. And I was doing journalism at the same time. My source of income was journalism while I was studying journalism. And I realized that I was taking lessons from people who had no practical experience. They'd only studied the course. And thus I had more experience than a lot of the people I was learning journalism from. And it was a very weird experience. And I've always said, and I love that you have this perspective, that I value the time that I went to school and the things that I learned, but I don't think it's necessary. And another thing that you've touched on here that I think is really important for anyone who wants to get into writing, some people, the way that they think, the way that they learn is not compatible with the education system. Don't think, if you're watching this and you want to get into video game writing, that because you don't have a degree or that you don't learn that way, that you can't get into it, because you absolutely can. Just a different facet.
No, we've stumbled onto a subject that I have thought about and have a lot to say about over the years. I don't know if you've ever seen the Rodney Dangerfield movie Back to School, where so Rodney Dangerfield is, he's this incredibly successful, he's very obnoxious, but this incredibly successful business kind of maven. He runs this like hugely successful chain of like retail stores, like selling clothes to like oversized men, like big and tall clothing stores, and he's worth a fortune. And his kid is having trouble in college, and to try and help his kid, he says, "I'll enroll in college with you as well, and I'll be like your buddy." And so this like 50-year-old guy goes to college, and it's Rodney Dangerfield, so he rubs everyone the wrong way, and that's the general gist of it. But there's a scene in it and there's a scene in the Tom Cruise movie Cocktail that's very similar to this, but the Rodney Dangerfield version's better, where he's sitting in this business class, and this very kind of stuffy business professor is trying to talk to the class about how business works. But Rodney Dangerfield, just as a guy who's actually run a business in the real world for many years and been super successful at it, is pushing back on everything, going like, that works in a classroom, but none of this shit's going to work once you hit reality. Yeah. And he's sort of about, well, what about the Teamsters? You got to pay those guys off. Like, where's that in the class? In all this kind of stuff. And there's a big difference between that and academic learning and what happens in the real world. And
I wish that there had been a class throughout my degree where they taught us how to deal with being a freelancer. That is such a big reality of being a writer. There are no classes about that. And it's like, if I were to structure that, I would be like, here's a whole semester on how to manage yourself as a freelancer and how to pitch. Because that's stuff that I learned from practice.
Because the writing is only a very small part of it.
Totally. Right? Writing's almost less of a part of it than pitching.
And we should talk about pitching, because that's a whole other thing, and it's something I've learned a lot about I used to be terrible at it. I've become very good at it, but 20 years ago, it took me 20 years to get good at it.
I think I'm still okay.
To bring it back to writing, this is why I'm very, very skeptical about screenwriting books and screenwriting seminars, particularly those that are written and taught by people that have never actually had anything produced in the business. Like I remember seeing a book a few years ago. It was like the secrets to writing $1 billion blockbuster movie. And I looked on but I've never heard of this guy. I've been in trust me, if this guy's done anything, I've heard of him. And I'm looking at his credits. He's got no credits. He's never had a movie produced. I'm like, man, if you actually, hold on a second.
That's strange.
You actually have the secrets
to
writing $1 billion movie, why don't you go do that?
Why are you writing this?
There's way more money in it than writing this book.
Wow,
and so there are screenwriting books that I recommend and things that I will send people to go read, but they're generally from people that have actually been there and done it. And talk to other writers. I've talked to people like Craig Mazin, who's a showrunner on Last of Us, and other writers will tell you that there's many of us in the business who are in the trenches, who work in screenwriting, who have done it for 20 years, who know how it actually works, that look a lot at a lot of these like seminars and courses and books and recognize them for exactly what they are, which is snake oil sold by people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Of all the writers that I know, or that I'm like even good friends with, I don't think I know any of them that attend those seminars. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them are run by people who are trying to make money off of the appeal of Hollywood, of people who want to work in Hollywood. The only thing that I know that people consider to generally be pretty useful is like DC, I know, has a course that they offer to people. You can't apply, you have to be nominated for being a showrunner. There are like showrunner academy things that are supposed to be super valuable that some of the companies hold that people speak pretty highly of. But of all the writers I know, I don't know of any of them that attend seminars.
And I mean, look, I always say it's different for everyone. And this is why I'm very wary of rule books and like, you got to do it this way or that way. I think there are universal good best practices, but like everyone does it differently. Like you said earlier that you outline in great detail.
Yeah.
I don't. It depends on the project, but I don't. Like the thing that I just recently wrote, I wrote completely by the seat of the pants, and I think it's probably one of the best things I've ever written. Sometimes it just works out that way.
I'm doing that right now, and the problem that I have with doing that, this is just a screenplay that I'm writing, that I have been for the last couple of months, is that I keep going back all the time because I'm not planning ahead. I just keep rereading it, and I feel like I'm writing less than I am reading. I keep being like, hang on,
right?
When did I do this part? Okay, that happened there. This needs to happen here. Whereas if I have an outline, I don't do that so much.
I think, for most things I have at least, like, for example, for the Book of Eli, I had the outline. It was just, it was a beat sheet. It was one page because that movie doesn't have a lot of moving parts in terms of plot. It's a very, very basic plot. And so I needed to know where I was going. I needed to know what the beginning, middle, and end was. I needed a basic spine. But again, just for me, the way that I write, what I've discovered, and sometimes you have to write an outline because it's a contractual step. Like they want to see an outline before they'll commence you to script. Sure. And so I'll do it because I have to. but I don't find it useful because just the way that my brain works, when I'm writing an outline, what I'm doing is I'm writing about the thing that I'm going to write. It's not the actual end product. And I find that when I'm kind of one step removed from the actual writing, I'm not fully engaged. And so what I discover is all of my best moments of discovery and like, oh, I just had a brilliant idea. That happens when I'm actually in the page.
Yeah, that makes
actually
sense.
On the page.
For context, everybody who isn't familiar, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, Gary, Book of Eli was your first like sold screenplay, correct?
Wasn't my first sold one, but it was the first thing to get made.
Okay, and that was right after you were still working in journalism, or you just stopped?
No, I was long out by that point. I left in 2001, and I started screenwriting in 2001, 2002, and I sold my first thing in around 2003. And then I kind of batted around the minor leagues for about 4 years, doing little uncredited rewrite jobs and things like that, and getting paid but not getting paid but not getting made.
Yeah.
And then I wrote Eli in 2007, and that was where my career really started.
Gotcha. So how does the process work of, again, we've just jumped off of two things here, but of getting something sold? What, like, there are a million books about that and a million seminars about that. How did you do it the first time?
A lot. I mean, again, when I did it,
you used to be able to submit things. That's a big difference.
For me now it's easy, right? Because I'm established, and I just give something to my agent, and they'll go try and sell it. Yeah. Like I have people know who I am. Sometimes I can just call a producer. I've been doing this for 20 years. I can just call a producer or a guy at a studio and say, "Hey, you want to read this?" I mean, I will always go through my agent, but for whatever reason, if I want to, I can just talk to people directly because people know who I am.
But before that,
I'm sorry?
But before that, how did you
before that, it was much more difficult. And I wouldn't even know how to advise people to do it now because the internet has changed a lot of things. It's much easier now. Like when I first started writing, it was hard to get your hands on scripts, to even like figure out like what a good script, how it's formatted, what it looks like. Because that's what I mostly tell people to do. I said, don't read a lot of books about screenwriting, but read a lot of screenplays. Like find the screenplays to your favorite movies and like see how they were written on the page and understand how, because this, Alana, like screenwriting has a particular rhythm and a cadence to it. It's not like any other form of writing. It's about trying to, basically your objective is to try to get the reader to imagine the movie in their head as vividly as possible, using as few words as possible, right? And it's a very specific discipline, and it's something you can get very good at. I always point people to this. It's very easy to find. Go find the original draft of Alien, written by David Giler and Walter Hill.
I haven't read
It's almost like a fucking haiku. It uses so few words, but you so vividly see the movie in your head. It's just an absolute.
My recommendation is always The Godfather. Read The Godfather's screenplay, especially because it was adapted. But I'm in the habit of doing that, and I think I mentioned this on Twitch recently. Of any movie that I like, if I like the screenplay, I will immediately go find it if I can.
Yeah,
I just saw Sicario and I was like, holy shit, this screenplay, and immediately went and read it.
And it's fascinating to see. Again, it's always interesting how it works on the page, and like
you get through them fast. They don't take long to read. It's not a lot of pages. They're really quick.
A good screenplay, you will burn. They're not that many words.
No,
you will. If a good screenplay, and again, this is a really easy way to identify an amateur screenwriter from a professional is. If there's, I don't know if people even use this term anymore, but when I was coming up, there used to be this term, too much black. There's too much black. And what they mean by that is the writing is too dense. If I'm going through a screenplay and I'm seeing like thick paragraphs of text, that this person does not know how to write because you're using too many words. I guarantee you, as an experienced screenwriter, I can take that 8 to 10 lines of a scene description and turn that into 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And that's the discipline that you develop. You never really need to have a paragraph on a screenplay that's more than 3 lines long. If I'm going over 3 lines, I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And you want it to be breezy. You want the writer to be able to like skip through it very quickly.
Video games are pretty much the same.
Yeah.
If you have a paragraph, you're taking someone else's job away from them, to be honest.
And they're not novels. You have to learn, again, and I don't want to sound like too like full of myself or anything, but the truth is this, the rules change as you become more established. The more established you become, the more you can break the rules.
Sure.
When you are a new writer, you do have to kind of adhere to I think most of the rules, the basic best practices that are out there. But then as you become more established, you get more, like Hank Aaron held the battle wrong, right? But he home runs anyway. Like a batting teacher would have looked at Hank Aaron and says, "You're doing that all wrong." But he would say, "Okay, but watch this," and he would hit a home run.
I'm glad you elaborated because I don't know shit about baseball. I was like, who is that and what are you talking about? Okay, got it. Yeah.
But if you find what works for you, the rules don't matter anymore. And like the last couple of things that I've written, I've broken any number of rules that earlier in my career I would have been very squeamish about. Yep. In the Book of Eli, there's a famous screenwriting book called Save the Cat by a guy called Blake Snyder, and it's bandied around a lot by you got to read Save the Cat, you got to read this book and that book, and it's one of the ones that gets bandied around a lot. I haven't read it, so I don't know. Maybe there's some good advice in there. Save the Cat, for people that aren't familiar with it, basically means that when you introduce your character at the beginning of the movie, you need to have them do something sympathetic or demonstrate some kind of likable or sympathetic trait so that you recognize that you are on their side. A good example is in the Disney movie Aladdin, right? He steals the piece of bread, but then he gives it to a little kid who needs it more than him. That's the Save the Cat moment. Yep. Literally taking the cat out of the tree. The
book is actually more about business than it is about writing, funnily enough.
Right, interesting. But obviously, with that rule that's a creative rule about like your character needs to do something sympathetic. Save the cat. The very first screenplay that I ever had made, the Book of Eli, he fucking kills a cat on page 1. He does the exact opposite of saving the cat. He fucking murders it and eats it. And that screenplay got made with Oscar-winning actors and went on to do very well. There he is right behind me there. And, it gave me the career that I have today. So rules, I think rules are good right up until the point where you realize there's an instance where breaking them is actually better.
Totally.
Than adhering to the rule. And again, as you become more experienced, you develop a better sense for when it's okay to do that.
So we're talking a lot about screenwriting. How much do you think screenplay varies or differs from video games in your experience?
Really depends on the kind of game that you're writing.
Yeah.
I think if you're writing something somewhat linear, like God of War or Last of Us or Uncharted, where I don't mean to sound reductive because I know it isn't as simple as this, but
I feel like God of War, as much as I can say that what we write looks pretty similar to a screenplay.
But I'm just saying in terms of like it is basically a screenplay or a TV series, broken down into these little bite-sized chunks, sure. Right? And interspersed with gameplay. And part of the artistry of that is figuring out what's the right ratio. Like when do we next go to story? How much story do we want to tell in this next piece before we go back to the gameplay? How much story do we want to tell emergently within the gameplay? Because that's obviously a thing as well, right? The kind of the immersive storytelling that just happens as you're playing. But you look at something like Last of Us, and people have done this, right? They just cut together all the cutscenes in The Last of Us, and you can watch it like it's a movie, and it basically works. And so it's not radically different in that way. And if I were to do any more video game writing work, it's something I've kind of moved away from a little bit, to be honest. But if I were enticed to go back and write a video game, it would be something that is more like Last of Us or Uncharted or God of War, where I can approach it just like a screenplay where I've just got to figure out how to break it into episodic pieces. Mm-hmm. Unlike the experience I had on The Walking Dead, which, don't get me wrong, that was a brilliant experience. We won a lot of awards and, it's been great for me. But that game, because of the degree to which it branches and you can tell your own story and just the technical side, again, this is where the left side of my brain starts to shut down when you think about, but if he said that in the previous scene, then that branch is not valid, and now you have to do this. And I wrote episode 4 of season 1 of The Walking Dead, where by the time there's a scene at the end where Lee, spoiler alert, after he gets bitten, has to go find Clementine, who's been kidnapped at that point, and he asks other members of the group that are with him if they're going to come with him. And at that point, the game does a calculation, which is the sum total of every single decision you've made with every character up until that point, and also how they interrelate with other characters. Like, if you were nice to this guy, maybe he'll come with you, or if you weren't, maybe he won't. That's simple enough. But it's also like, if that character doesn't like this guy, this other character, and this character's coming with you, now that guy doesn't want to go because he doesn't like that other, and it's like the Venn diagram. It's not the Venn, but like the flow chart of it all is so mind-bogglingly complex. And the other thing is just the volume of writing, because you have to write 8-10 different versions of every scene, all the different ways that they can branch out and play. Like the first draft that I wrote of The Walking Dead was like 600 pages long.
Wow.
For if that was a TV episode, it'd be a tenth of that. Yeah. Because you have to write every possible permutation. And so in terms of volume and in terms of like logical construction, it's a nightmare. It would be very, very, it's incredibly satisfying when the game comes out and it works. I remember watching all the Let's Plays and watching people agonize over the decisions that we had built and having a ton of fun with that. But getting there is really, really hard. So for me, I would be happy to do more game writing, but but it would need to be something that's more in the kind of the linear side, because I think I love to play the more adventurous kind of narrative games, and I think that all of the most exciting possibilities in writing right now are actually on the video game side, because film and television, those are mediums that have been around for almost they're almost 100 years. Like, film's more than 100 years old. TV's coming out will be almost 100 years old pretty soon. Like, you can still do amazing, like, innovative things in film, but the formula is, as you said, is pretty established. Whereas in video games, I think we're still kind of in the silent movie era of, like, figuring out what we can do with the tools, and what does it mean that we can.
It's only going to get better.
What does it mean that we? Well, what's interesting to me is, and I think about this a lot, is that when each new storytelling medium comes along, it always starts out by mimicking the storytelling medium that came before it. So, for example, like, what did we have? In the beginning, well, around a campfire, but, like, in terms of, like, actually scripted stories, right? People stood on a stage, right? And we would watch a Shakespeare play or whatever. And when film first came along, what did it do? It mimics that, right? It just had a camera essentially in the front row of the theater watching actors perform on a stage. But then very quickly, people began to realize, oh, wait, hold on a minute. We can put the camera anywhere we want. We can cut, we can edit, we can develop our own cinematic language by putting the camera anywhere we want, and we can jump from one period to another, and we can use that to tell a more interesting story. And the language of cinema began to emerge. Fast forward to, like, the 1990s, I guess, when CD-ROM became a thing, and we realized that we could film live actors and do more adventurous stuff with stories. What did we do? We copied film. We made interactive movies, which weren't really that interactive, and they were pretty shitty as movies. And so we had to realize that, no, that's not the thing. Rather than try to copy cinema, how do we lean into the things into the unique tools that video games offer us, which is interactivity, branching, nonlinearity. And now we're starting to see the language of video games starts. But again, we're still banging rocks together, figuring out how to do it. So we're absolutely in the silent movie era of video games.
I find it really
exciting. 20, 30 years ago, I'll be fascinated to see 20, 30 years from now where we are narratively, because we're still figuring it out.
Yeah.
But there are amazing people working in the field of video games narratively, telling stories that can only be told in video game form, because they only work if you use those tools.
Journey.
And Journey's a great example. I think a lot about Braid, which is, just incredible things. I think about The Artful Escape, that does one of my favorite games in the last couple of years. And we could go down a rabbit hole of mentioning many others as well. But we're still just at the beginning of that process. And while I think that is where all the really adventurous stuff and discovery and exploration and evolution is going to happen in writing, I'll happily play those games, but I'm too lazy to be a part of that effort. I'll just play them.
Yeah, it is that's what excites me about working in video games. That's what I love about it, is that, like, we're only moving in a direction. I said to you, I was just doing this radio thing for ABC in Australia, is what I just came from, and I was just ending up, like, enthusing about how video games are just starting out, and I can't fathom what games look like in 20 years, which is exactly what you've just said. And I think that's so cool in terms of storytelling. Is like, where are they going and what are they going to look like? We just don't know yet. I can't even picture.
And then add VR into the mix, because I think we're in the silent movie era in VR as well. Like, we're still figuring that out. But we will
fitness. That's what sells.
But we will get there. And I think that, the kind of storytelling that is going to be prevalent, I still think it's decades away, but I do think we will get to the point where the idea of watching, like, a linear pre-baked story on a flat screen is going to seem very quaint to, like, my kids when they're my age. You know what I mean?
Oh, excuse me, God. But that kind of thing that you're talking about, which is, like, more emergent, which is a thing I feel really strongly about. If I have an agenda in video game writing, it is that I would like to tell as much of a story as possible through gameplay without cutscenes. Like, I feel very strongly, can we say this through gameplay without it needing to be a cutscene? Can we make sure the player has control? I feel very strongly about that. And I think it's something that we're only going to see more and more and more of, as complicated as it is. It's Half-Life, right? Like,
you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say Half-Life does an amazing job of telling a story where the main character never speaks and there's never a cutscene, but you get a full story. And that's
Yes.
incredible.
It does
And
have
that game's what, 25 years old now?
I don't know how to mute my Apple Watch. Gary, do you know how to mute an Apple Watch?
Yes. Flip up,
Flip
and
up.
there's a thing that looks like a little bell, and click on that.
Bell. Aha, thank you.
There you go.
I
Tech
guess
tip.
I
You get free
unmuted
tech
it the
tips
other
as well.
day. Yeah, and I didn't know how to remute it. Because the meetings just started. Uh what was I talking about before I had to
Half-Life.
mute my Apple Watch? Yeah, the issue with Half-Life, I think, is that there's like a it's not necessarily ludonarrative dissonance, but a disconnect because the player can jump around a dramatic scene. You're locked in a room, but you can still jump around in circles, which means that they can kind of ignore the context of that scene. How do you make a player, through gameplay, do something that is in line with the narrative bit that is being told at that exact same point in time? And I think that's a really interesting
where I
challenge.
struggle, and it's something that I don't know why game developers still hold on to this because they still use it a lot, and I feel like we should have figured out. I don't know the answer. I feel like there has to be a better one. Is like, for example, a big pet peeve of mine is audio logs. Like I understand that's oh, here's a cassette player and someone's left an audio log, and I understand that's how they're like parceling out the story, but my brain can't not think about like what was the context in which this person decided to record this audio. Like it makes no sense
I
that
never
they would
listened to them.
No, I don't either, and I don't think they're a good way to tell a story. And there just has to be a better way. I don't know what it is yet, but the audio logs thing to me is so played out at this point.
Well, and they're also usually pretty optional, right? They're not even entirely necessary. I think that they like serve an interesting purpose, and you're right that they take you out of the scene. Like in BioShock, which is the one that really popularized that. I think in that world, because you are with a bunch of scholars who I would record themselves being pensive, it kind of makes sense in that universe. A lot of other cases, like in Callisto Protocol, even in Dead Space.
It's like, again, why did you record this other than you wanted a player to listen to it later? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
I do like games where you can go through somebody's computer, like Deathloop doing that, where you can read their emails. I think Deathloop did a really good job of that because you, in character, read I don't remember what they call, like visionaries, I think they're called, arguing with each other. And then you see them realize that you're reading the emails as well. Like, I really like that touch where you can choose to dig through somebody's computer, because I feel like what we have in our PCs probably is pretty telling. Like, the amount of, like, games that I have installed is even going to give you a picture of who I am, right? Like,
the other trope that I think has become very overused is the idea that you've always got someone in your ear on a radio talking you through everything.
Yeah.
Like, and again, that to me is like less of a stretch, because I think there are often times when you can contrive the story in such a way that it makes sense that you've got someone in your ear.
But
I think we still keep falling back on these same tired ways to present story, when I don't know, I just feel like eventually we're going to push beyond this.
We will, and I think it's exciting. But for context, Gary, because I realized I didn't ask, usually I would at the start of the show, and I should have. What games have you worked on?
Lots of different ones in lots of different capacities. The one that I'm most well known for is I was one of the story. I was on the main story team for Telltale Games, The Walking Dead season 1. And I wrote I helped write the whole story, all 5 episodes, as well as the DLC 400 Days, and I wrote episode 4.
Yeah.
And that was, as you remember, I mean, God, more than 10 years old now, but that was incredibly successful, won tons of awards. I have my name on a BAFTA because of it, because we won a BAFTA for Best Narrative. And I'm very, very proud of that. And then beyond then, I worked on Duke Nukem Forever back in the day, when they finally released the game, they credited everyone that ever worked on every version of it. So there's a massive long scroll of everyone, and my name is in there somewhere, even though there's, again, none of my DNA in the actual finished game that was made. I worked on the original Prey back in the day. I worked on the original Gears of War back in the day. Again, just very, very early world building stuff. I was a story consultant on Halo 5 Guardians. I would just sit in a story room with them and kind of like break story with them and suggest ideas, but I didn't actually write any of the stuff in the game. Just kind of help them figure out what they wanted to do. And then I guess most recently I did some very, very early foundational kind of world building lore stuff on Forspoken that just came out.
Yeah, so I've seen people credit you as one of the writers for Forspoken on Twitter, I think, but I'm of the understanding that you also didn't actually write any dialogue for that either, right?
I mean, I don't think so. I remember not right. I mean, I never wrote an actual line of dialogue, but at the same time, I haven't seen the finished game. I don't know. I've not played it.
Sure.
So I honestly don't know. I think I'm credited as like original concept or something like that. Just to be clear. So what happened was Square came to me like 5-6 years ago and said, we have this idea. But it's just a germ of an idea. Would you be willing to help us like build out the world and the mythology and the story? And I went away and came up with some ideas for them, presented them, they liked them, and they said, would you run a writer's room to like really build it out? And so I love writer's rooms. It's one of my favorite places to be, is like when nothing pleases me more. I get no more joy out of anything like being in a room with like other really talented writers and just like chewing the fat and talking about story. It's obviously very, very common in TV. It's pretty much how all TV is made. It's become increasingly common in film. Like for example, like I did this recently for a project where they had an idea for a studio had an idea for a movie that an actor had brought to them. The actor comes in and says, I want to play this kind of character. Let's develop that story. And so they'll assemble a bunch of writers who are very well paid to sit in a room for a week and just talk about story. And one person runs the room and puts ideas down on a whiteboard. I've done that on several. I did it on Sherlock Holmes 3 for Robert Downey Jr.
They did it with movies.
They do. So they do it. They do them. So they do them. There's various different elements of which they used to do them on the back end. So if a movie is broken and they don't know how to fix it, they will bring in a bunch of writers to brainstorm ideas how to fix it. It's very, very common in comedy, where they'll just have comedy writers come in just to punch it up and just basically just pitch jokes.
Yeah.
What if you said this? What if that happened? And then, but now it's increasingly now happening on the front end where, like, for example, on Sherlock Holmes 3, they knew they wanted to make a third one, but they didn't, and they knew kind of what they wanted to do, like where they wanted to set it, but they didn't have a story. And so myself and a bunch of other writers sat in a room on the Warner Brothers lot for a week. What if Sherlock did this? What if Moriarty did that? What if Watson, what if this happened? And like, you come up with story ideas, and then the person who's running the room takes that to the studio, and maybe they end up writing the script or whatever. And I've done a bunch of those, and it's really fun. And that's kind of what we did with what eventually became Forspoken. I said I'd like to do a room, and I got to handpick a bunch of writers that I admire from film and television and video games and literature. And we sat in a room in LA for a week, and just with the executives, the guys from Square, and we pitched a bunch of ideas and came up with them. Here's how magic would work, and here's the history of the world and that kind of stuff. Like, the one thing that I know that I contributed to the game is the name of the world, like Athia. That was just something I came up with, and now the world in the game is still called Athia. But that's literally the only thing I know for sure of mine that's in the game. And then what happened was, some months after that, they came back to me and one of the other writers and said, we're going to start over and kind of to completely reboot the story. We want it to be this now. And what they pitched us was something that's very closer to what they actually have now, which is about a girl from the real world that gets sucked into this fantasy world. That wasn't anything, the version that we did was nothing like that.
Gotcha.
They said, we want this girl from the real world to get sucked into this fantasy universe. And the problem was, at that point, neither me nor the other writer were available anymore because we were too busy, and they want us to write the whole thing. We both knew what a huge undertaking it is to write a whole video game. Yeah. So we said, look, best of luck with it. Obviously use any of the stuff that we gave you if it's compatible with this new version, but like, we can't go any further.
Yeah.
And then I think Amy and Todd came in after us and did some work. And then they left. And I think there was a bunch of other writers that actually wrote the game.
Yeah.
But we were talking about this before we went live. You know how this works. All of the kind of the basement dwelling geniuses on Twitter see my name and they see Amy Hennig's name, and we're the two most recognizable names as writers attached to it. Go, oh, you must have written the game. Yes. And I'm like, I'm not going to go out there on Twitter and say I didn't write any of it, because I don't want it to. I don't want it to. I honestly don't even know how well the game has been received. I don't know what its Metacritic is, or if it's good or bad. I honestly don't know. But like, I go out on my way, and you can go on Twitter, go search my Twitter feed and find this. Whether a game is good, or anything I've worked on is good or bad or anywhere in between, I will never ever claim more or less credit than I feel that I deserve. Like, for example, this happens to me all the time on Rogue One, because Rogue One obviously is the biggest thing I've ever worked on. And I'll get comments from people all the time saying like, oh, Rogue One is so great. I love Chirrut and Baze. Those characters are so cool. And I will immediately go, well, then you should thank Chris Weitz.
Yeah.
Because those are his characters. They were not in my script. He brought those in after I was done. If it's something that I did do, like Vader's Fortress, or the whole business of like, well, you know, it was my dad that helped build the Death Star. Now we've got to kind of do that whole thing. Like, I'll take credit for the things that I did, but I won't take credit for the things that I didn't. And that's true if something is good, and that's true if something is bad. So if I say to you, I had very little to do with Forspoken, it's not because the game is being perceived as good, bad, or anything else. It's because I had very little to do with Forspoken.
Honest, yeah.
That's just how it is. But it is irritating, and I think I think a lot of people are kind of often show the whole ass when they go, "Oh, Gary, you did this or that," when they have no fucking idea what they're talking about. They don't know how games are made.
Right, and probably not a great understanding of how games are made, and that's a thing that I think is...
Or film.
For sure. And I think that's an interesting thing to ask you that I've not had any other guests that this applies to. Everyone else that I've ever had on this show has worked full-time, like literally full-time employees, start to finish, on a game. That does not apply to you. So when you're being asked to come in for something short like Forspoken that you can't stay on long-term, or the story consulting for Halo, what does that experience look like? You're just in there for a week and you just give them a bunch of ideas in a room and then you never talk to them again? And is that common? Or is that something you think is like...
No, it's very common. And now that there is, you know, an understanding in games that writing is important.
Matters,
it never
actually,
used to be.
Glad they figured that out, or I wouldn't have a job.
Again, I am old enough to remember old video game reviews where, you know, it was a common trope. Oh, well, there's not much of a story, but what do you expect? It's a video game. We don't think like that anymore, right? And you know, back in the old days of game development, the story was handed off to whoever had the least to do, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you write the story. And now, of course, as you know, Alana, there's like massive narrative teams and dedicated, you know, a lot of time is spent on story, and rightly so, because I think the expectation games have shown in the age of you know, God of War and The Walking Dead and The Last of Us and all these games that tell amazing stories, that there's no excuse anymore to not tell a good story just because you're a video game.
Yes.
Right?
I think there's still a struggle with some studios where, like, someone who isn't a writer or has no writing experience thinks that they know how to write, and then you end up with a story that is not very cohesive or a very frustrated writer's room. I've heard of that happening at a number of studios that I won't share, where people who aren't writers think they can write, and it sucks for all the other writers who are writers. That still happens.
Well, again, I work in Hollywood. Trust me, I spend a lot of time in rooms with people that don't know how to write, but they've read one screenwriting book and they think they know everything.
Yeah.
It took a while for us to get here. Once we didn't get everything right, like in that age of kind of interactive movies, I remember a lot of time they would just say, well, let's just bring in a big time Hollywood screenwriter. I mean, they would bring in some big time Hollywood screenwriter who's never played a video game.
Yeah.
Who would pitch a bunch of ideas that are completely not appropriate to be told in a video game format
either. Like scope is such an important part of writing a video game, where I feel like you probably don't have to think about that in the same capacity when you're writing a screenplay.
And it was a learning process for me as well. I remember sitting around the table on The Walking Dead with Sean Vanneman, who was the real genius. It's Sean and Jake are the real geniuses behind The Walking Dead. I was just lucky to be in the room with them. And I would pitch an idea, and they would say, "That's great, but there's nothing." And they would say, "That's great, but there's nothing for the player to do." Like, where's the player in all of this? And that's where you have to remember, right? If the player isn't interacting all the time, they're going to start tuning out. And now they're just watching a TV show. Yeah. And who cares? There's already a Walking Dead TV show. And so it took me a while to kind of develop that sense as well of like how you got to keep the player engaged.
Yeah.
But we're better at it now. Video game, the big video game companies have their own narrative people who are experts in their field, right? You know, there are the kind of the Casey Hudsons and, you know, the Matt Sofases and the people out there that are like, they live, breathe and sleep video game storytelling, and they're experts in that particular field. And then there are people like me that are somewhat in the middle, where because I came from video games and still love and play video games, it's in my DNA. And because I've done 20 years in Hollywood, I'm kind of bilingual, and I understand like why I can also do it. And so they'll often come to people like me. But it's taken a while to get there. And like I said, we're still learning. Like every day is a school day as we try to figure out how best can we tell a story inside a video game.
Yeah, but what are these sort of like more short-term consultancy
Oh,
type
sorry,
jobs look like.
sorry, that was your actual
It's
question.
okay.
I really enjoy doing them. I'm much more of a front end writer than a back end writer, and what I mean by that is, and I'd be a lot richer if I was good at this, but like I'm not a script doctor kind of person. Like I used to early in my career get sent scripts like, here's a finished script, but the third act is broken. Can you fix it? I'm not that kind of a writer. I'm
totally
not good
am.
at that.
I way prefer that.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to do very well, Alana.
Yeah.
You're probably going to be very rich because that's where the real money is. There are writers in Hollywood earning in the region of $350,000 a week fixing scripts. Because look at it this way, right? They somehow got ahead of themselves. This happens all the time in Hollywood. They're literally on set shooting, burning millions of dollars a day on crew, and the pages aren't shootable. Right. And so if you are the kind of guy like I don't know whose names who I would throw out, but like there are these people who can sit in a trailer on set and fix those pages on the day and turn a non-shootable page into a shootable page. That's worth a fortune to the studio, right? You are saving them so much money. It's worth what they're paying you. But my brain is just not wired to do that. I can fix problems in my own script, but for some reason, I'm not very good at like identifying what's wrong with someone else's
I'm better
script.
at it. Yeah.
And I just don't like rewriting other people.
Yeah,
I just don't like it. Because I don't like no one likes to be rewritten, and I don't like rewriting other people. I'm much better on the front end, working from a blank canvas where it can still be anything, where you can really get your hands in kind of the raw clay and shape what it is, and you can go in any direction. That's what I did on Forspoken. It's what I did on Halo. Those projects, there was virtually nothing when I came in, and so I could pitch an idea that would, it's not like, oh well, the game's already developed in such a way that wouldn't work. Like early in the process, anything can theoretically
I'm sure
work.
a lot of people would love to do that. What was the first game that you did it on?
Probably maybe Gears.
That's a great one to start with.
But I mean, I didn't even really do that much. Again, it was really just Cliffy came to me and said, "Would you be interested in helping me like figure out the world a little bit?" And I wrote some stuff for him. I don't know if I even ever got paid. Maybe I did. Duke Nukem, Prey, the original one back in the day. I remember saying to them, "You cannot have a Native American character called Tommy Hawk. You just cannot do it. You're going to get fucking murdered." And I remember them saying, "Like, what's wrong with it?" I'm like, "Do you really want to find out?" And put the publish. And originally, and then eventually they called him Tommy Towody. But like, you're going to get murdered. Like, seriously.
Oh no.
But here's the funny thing. The reason why they actually changed it is because they were worried about Tony Hawk having a problem with it.
Wow.
Like it wasn't even like, oh no, this is like really racially insensitive.
Oh my god, that's so funny.
Oh my god, I could tell stories like this all day long.
So I did the first one started because Cliff approached you because like how did
because I knew Cliffy from my journalism days.
So I guess that's also a tough one to ask. It's like, I've never had anyone on the show before who's done that kind of work. How do you get into that side of things? I think there are probably a lot of people who would love to like just come in and do the creative ideas type of thing, then hand it off. That sounds like I'm sure it's very hard, but I'm sure a lot of people would love to do it.
I get asked this question a lot, like how do I get into games writing? And I think there's three ways to do it. One is you can go make your own game. You can be a Mike Bithell. Right, you can but you got to know how to make the game. You can't just write it. You got to know how to build the game around it as well. There are still one man, genius people out there, right? Like the Bithells of the world, and John Blow, and the people that know the story they want to tell, and they can build the game that tells that story. You can get a job at a video game company, like start at the lowest rung on the ladder, and work your way up to getting on the narrative team. Right?
Yeah,
internally.
We had one of the writers who worked on God of War Ragnarok started in QA and basically expressed to one of the other writers that she really wanted to write, and then she did, and she helped out with a bunch of Freya scenes and did a fantastic job. And I love that the studio gave her that opportunity too. They were like, "Yeah, let's do it."
I think that's a legitimate way, but you got to start at the bottom. You can. I don't know too much about the academic route, but I know that like Full Sail and places, that specifically teach kind of game narrative and game design courses. I think those are legitimate ways in. Game developers and publishers do look at people that have those accreditations. or you can you can do what I did and develop your reputation as a writer elsewhere,
Yes.
right? So I was a screenwriter, film, television. I was a novelist, comic books. Like people knew I could write.
Yes.
And they also knew that I knew video games.
think-
So it wasn't a big stretch to imagine that I could also write a video game.
Reputation is an important thing that I've also never spoken about on this show. I've said this before, but like I've had people criticize me or be like, you only got a job because you have a following, where that applied to Santa Monica Studio. And my attitude towards that is, no, I didn't. My attitude towards that is, well, that's an asset that I built to help me be employable. Like, if you see that as something that helped me get a job, then use it to help you get a job too, which is exactly what you're talking about here, really, Gary, is like, you knew Cliff. You know people. You have an established reputation in a field that can help. And I think it certainly does if you want to do the kind of thing you do, which is be hired for who you are. You are hired because you're Gary Whitta and people know your body of work. Do you have any approach to how to tackle that side of things? Like to get your name out there, to make sure that people want to work with you specifically?
You've just got to, there's no easy answer. You've just got to do the work. There's no shortcut. Like, it took me 20 years. I've been writing professionally, if you include my journalism career, for 35 years, 20 years of that in screenwriting.
Yeah.
And I'm at a point now where, I'm very well established, and there's any number of jobs. I'll give you. I won't tell you what it is because I'm not allowed. But like, I just booked like a really big video game adaptation, like a live action thing, and I got it partly because of who I am, and they know I can do the job. And I pitched them a version of the movie that they were like, "Oh wow, like you've actually cracked it," and like I'm going to write that movie.
That's awesome.
But it took me 20 years to get there. And there's no easy way to do it. Like, I used to get questions. People always like, they want the shortcut. Like, how do I get an agent? I don't have you written a script?
Yeah.
Like, it's like you got to put one foot in front of the other. I'm actually curious about your story because I still remember vividly, Alana, when you and I and Mike were on the Xcast prior to the show. You said, "Hey guys, I'm not going to be able to do the Xcast anymore because I'm going to go work for Santa Monica Studio." And we were like, "Oh wow, that's amazing!" But like, how did that happen? Because obviously, like, I know you're a writer. I know that you are, you're a critic. You're very creative. You've got smart thoughts about video games and stuff like that. But how did all of that, like, how did you parlay all of that into actually kind of crossing the barrier into now working in game development on the narrative side?
I worked at Rooster Teeth as a stepping stone to get, and I've said this even when I worked there, to get into game writing, which is what I wanted to do. So I went from journalism.
Okay.
Rooster Teeth was a middle ground where they did fictional content. Like they have Ruby, they had video games, they had, when I was there, Arizona Circle, so like fictional stuff that I could get professional experience writing on, and then moving from there. But I also did a lot of game jams. So some of them under a different name that are published. You can play game jam games that I wrote on to get that experience. And I've written on 3 indie games, one of which has been announced that I posted about on Twitter forever ago, 2 others that haven't. So it was basically that part of it was me just like really being like, I want to get this experience to write things because I want to write video games. So just making sure that I did that however I could. And actually getting to work there, I think the thing that is the biggest credit to me, because Santa Monica Studio was not the first conversation I had. Like, it was a junior role that I had to apply for, and, I had interviews with 20 people, whatever, had to submit writing samples that I thankfully already had. And I was able to submit other things that I had worked on in terms of video games as well, including one that I'm hoping gets announced pretty soon, which is like a game people are excited about. In any case, I think the thing that helped me more than anything was that I had met people there. So like I knew people at Santa Monica Studio already and had worked with them before, but that anytime I go to a DICE or a GDC or whatever, I just talk to people very enthusiastically about video game writing. And thus, I think it made people consider me for video game writing things, because I was just there talking to them about the things I think are good and the things that I want to do.
No, that's smart.
Like, I've had people say to my face, before I started being a video game writer, people in dev, you should be writing video games. That's the thing Corey said to me. You should be writing video games. And so it was just making sure I had the experience and accruing the experience. Obviously, a lot of it came from, like, it started with university, obviously, studying screenwriting. I studied some stuff that, like, is akin to game design in terms of narrative, but wasn't a game design course at the time. Getting the experience and also just meeting a lot of people, establishing a name and telling people that that's what I wanted to do. And then eventually someone's going to be like, you have some good ideas. I like those. Do you want to work with us? And that's pretty much how it happened. But similarly to
Right.
you, I've now been doing it for 12 years, so it took a
And
long
this
time.
is and you and I are great examples of how like your story is like totally different to mine, right? In terms of how we both got, you know, our game writing journey. And so it's no there's no it's not, people ask me all the time how I broke in. So I'm happy to tell you like
Well, I
anecdotally,
think
but like
our press thing started the same way.
yes.
I was 17, but I was doing the same thing, which is basically just I was writing reviews in my own time for fun,
Right.
and then I eventually just started submitting them to people for volunteer work. And I was like, let me
Right.
write for you. And I wrote as a volunteer for over a year, and then pitched to a magazine, and a print magazine was my first ever paid writing job. Was I had a review of Company of Heroes published in a print magazine.
Yeah, it was mine too. Yeah.
And that's pretty similar approach.
But then I'm saying I spent a lot of years in like kind of legacy media, film and television, and then kind of came in sideways where I think, you know, again, your route was somewhat different. And this is why when people ask me how I broke into screenwriting, they're asking me, A, because maybe they're just interested in the story, but also because they like, what can I learn? And I always say, like, I'll tell you anecdotally what my story is, but like, it's not, I don't think it's replicable. Like, I don't think anything I don't think there's anything about my story where someone else would go, oh, I'll go do that.
No, I suspect that of the screenplays I've written, I don't have a ton of interest in publishing them, but if I were to get one sold, I don't think it would be that difficult for me to do, and I base that on the people I know at this point, in that I have one that I was like, this actress would really like this, and I was like, when I finish it, I should just give it to her, and I know that she has the resources to get it made if she likes it. And when I was writing it, and I was like, oh, it suits her a ton, I should just give it to her, and then she would be like, if she likes it, she'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, let's make this, and that's very easy to do, but is just a result of me existing in similar spaces as people who work in that industry, and I don't know how to tell someone to do that either.
And like I said, I'm in that position as well, where like if I want to, like for example, again, I don't name names publicly, but like for example, there's a TV pilot that we're trying to put a director on right now, and like the 3 top directors who would be gangbusters for it, like I know them personally, and I just like, there's no agents, you just call them up, hey, you want to hear a pitch?
Yeah.
And 5 minutes later you're on Zoom with them.
Yeah.
Because I've been doing this for 20 years. But like that's it's not the answer that people want to hear, but like the true answer is like, oh, how do I do what you do? Well, spend 20 years failing and getting rejected and beating your head against the wall and thinking about quitting and hating yourself and having existential crises and going to therapy and asking yourself why the fuck you do this for a living.
Totally.
And eventually maybe you'll have some success. But
I have this tweet that I have a screenshot of that I haven't deleted, that was when I was still writing as a volunteer, and I was desperately trying to find a way to make money writing video games.
How far back are we going?
I think it's from 2012.
Okay.
And I said something along the lines of like, I'm so close to quitting. Is someone someday going to pay me to write about video games? I don't know if I can do this anymore. It was like something along those lines. And I love that that's still there. The fact that I have that as a thing that like is like, yeah, you did do it. And I had every opportunity to give up. And the failures are a thing we don't talk about a lot. I applied for a job at IGN 6 times before I got one. 6 times. I didn't just apply and then get handed a job. Like, it was a job that was so unrealistically perfect for my skill set. That was after university. Like, all of it, like, none of it's easy. And I think you're probably right that the getting to know people part, which makes everything a lot easier, is just a result of having to have been okay with failing many, many, many times.
It's so funny. I did the Xcast yesterday. And they had the developers of Knockout City on there, and Knockout City is just, you know, is getting sunsetted, yeah. And it was, you know, the guys were there, and I said, I'm glad to be here with you talking about failure because I'm an expert. You know, I've been doing this for a long time, and one of the wisest that I'll just repeat what I said on the Xcast yesterday. One of the wisest things that anyone ever said to me, and I use it when I talk all the time publicly about writing, is failure is not the opposite of success. It's a part of it. It's a necessary part of it. And I think there is a certain amount of Darwinism, natural selection that happens in writing or in any field really, where the people who quit are the ones who are supposed to.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Because they can't hack it. And I've come close. I never came close to quitting earlier in my career because I always felt like, no, I'm going to keep going. I had setbacks, but no, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. And then I wrote Eli, and the door started to open for me. But like, even as no one's immune to this. Like, even as an established, I was talking to someone the other day, an A-list writer, higher on the totem pole than me, just got devastated, heartbroken, rejected on this thing. Doesn't matter how big you are, you're going to get kicked in the fucking face all the time. I remember on Mouse Guard, which is one of my favorite things I ever wrote. Everybody loved the script. It was a major movie at 20th Century Fox. had a big time director attached, $40 million in previs, sets, costumes, Idris Elba, Andy Serkis, 6 weeks from production. Disney bought Fox and shut down the movie because they just decided they didn't want to make it under the new regime. Man. When I got that phone call, I threw my fucking phone against the wall, and my wife had to come into my office to ask if I was okay. And I was like, no, I'm not fucking okay.
Yeah.
And they called me back and said the president of production of 20th Century Fox wants to call and apologize and explain to you what's going on.
Rough.
I said don't put him on the phone with me because I'm going to say something I'm going to regret, because I was in a really pissy mood.
Yeah.
That and one other time with the two closest times I've come this fucking close to quitting the business. I wrote a letter one time to a person involved on another project, and I showed it to my wife and I said, should I send this? And she said, why don't you sleep on it before you send it? And the next morning I was so glad I didn't send it, because I do, like, remember I said about not taking shit from anyone earlier? Like, sometimes that can work against me and I can push back too hard. You gotta like never make decisions in the heat of emotion, right? And like always take a count to 10 or however long it takes, take a minute to cool off. But like, the point I'm making is, both of the times I have come this close to quitting the business, I really was this close. I was literally thinking about how can I just get back into games. Were when I was really, really well established as a writer. And you'd think you'd be immune to shit like that by now, but you never, ever, ever are.
No, not if you care. Well, that means you're in the right thing,
and that's the thing, Alana, is you can only do this job and you can only do it well if you give a shit.
Yeah.
Right? You can't just phone it in. And the problem with it is when you fall in love with a piece of material, especially it's something you created. I mean, Mouse Guard wasn't something I created, but I fucking love that script. I love it so much. It's my second favorite thing I've ever written. And it's so, I know it's good. Like, I'm one of those like really writers, like, is it any good? I don't know. I'm really neurotic, but like, I fucking know that's a good script. It easily was good enough to get made as a $150 million movie. And it got killed for no reason to do with the script at all. It was just corporate Gods of Olympus bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, decided they were going to do something else. And you're never immune to that. And honestly, when you get fired or rewritten, or a project that you put your heart and soul into gets canceled, you honestly, or at least I do honestly, process it in almost exactly the same way that you process like a romantic breakup. Was it me? Could I have done more?
Sure.
I hate the person, but I still want to be with them. Like, is there some way I can fix this?
Yeah.
Like, and you agonize over it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much of this is like relatable to you, because I'm just like
totally.
I'm very emotionally fragile person, so this is how I deal with it. But I don't know, but it's fucking hard. But again, it is also just like romantic love, right? Like, after a really hard breakup, like, never again, I'm never going to put my heart on the line again. But of course you do. You get over it, and of course you do. Because what are you going to do? Be alone for the rest of your life? Never write again? Of course not.
No, and I actually suspect that for all the questions about like how do you make contacts, how do you find an agent, that kind of thing. If you and I are both people who can find writing jobs because we know people, which you certainly more than me, but I do feel that way about myself too. Probably a lot of that comes from loving it so much that you are willing to deal with the failures. And the sustainability, like you said, if it's been 12 years for me and over 20 for you, that is something that probably happens inevitably as long as you do it for a long enough amount of time and you don't burn the bridges when you fail. And you don't just like scorch the earth when something goes wrong, and that you keep pushing forward. Then for every time that I've submitted something to a studio, Santa Monica Studio was not the first studio that I applied to as a game writer. There were others that I got really far and didn't get the job because somebody had slightly more experience, or actually for all of them, it was someone with slightly more experience. It's very hard to find a junior job in the industry, to be honest. But all of those studios that I applied for and that I had interviews with and that read my samples are now contacts that I have who liked my writing that I could potentially work with again in the future on a different project where I'm more fitting. So for every failure, I still like met somebody and spoke to somebody. And for all of them too, the studios I applied at and didn't get work from, I was really like, hey, what can I do differently, or what should I be focusing on? Like, I asked them for follow-up calls to be like, what do I need to do to make sure I want to do this so bad? What do I need to do to make sure that I can do this? And each one of them, to their credit, sat with me and spoke to me for 30 minutes after telling me I didn't have the job to talk to me about what I needed to do or whatever. And that it's the resilience, I think, that gets you to the point where you know the people.
You've got to have the resilience. You've got to develop some kind of emotional callus. And again, the same reason why we get so upset is the same reason I remember saying after Mouse Guard, I'm never going to write another studio movie again. I've written like 5 since then. And it's because we are incurable romantics, right? We love what we love what we do. I love writing. It's also the only fucking thing I know how to do. Like, I'm not employable in any other field. I can't do anything. I don't know. I'm not good at anything else. It's the only thing I'm good at.
Probably same.
And so, but what you just described, Alana, is exactly what I was just saying. Like, failure is not the opposite of success; it's a part of it, right? And if you're and there's two types of people that when they fail, they either get pissy about it and sulk and give up, or they ask themselves, what can I take from this experience that I can learn and apply to the next thing? And every failure has value if you know how to dissect it and understand what you can learn. And it could be something as simple as, like, there are a handful of people in Hollywood that I will never work with again, because I know that they're assholes, and I will never, ever work with them again. And they burned me so badly for no reason, anything to do with the quality of the writing, just bullshit politics. Yeah. I have what I call my life's too short list. I will never work with them again.
I think I have
but we'll share it after the show. Can you imagine what premium Patreon content that would make?
Just all the people we don't want to work with.
Like, name your price for that one. But it's also just don't do it that way again. I'll give you a really good example. I gave up a long time ago writing original sci-fi spec scripts. And for people that don't know, that spec means speculative, right? It just means no one asked you to write it. You just decided to write a script on your own. And when it's finished, you say, hey, does anyone want to make this movie? That's how the Book of Eli was made. That was a spec script. And there isn't much of a spec market in Hollywood anymore. There used to be. There isn't anymore, because now everything's branded franchise. And that kills me, right? I mean, I do franchise work. I've written on Star Wars. I've written on, Walking Dead, Halo, all kinds of other stuff that's well known, Batman, all kinds of stuff. But, like, the stuff that I care about the most is the stuff that I create out of whole cloth, the original stuff. It's mine and only mine. Like, for example, if I hadn't got the Rogue One job, someone else would have written the movie instead, right? That movie was getting made no matter what. It would have been a different movie because someone else would have, helped write it, but Rogue One would be out there in some different form. But if I don't come up with the idea for the Book of Eli, no one else does, and that movie doesn't exist. And so for that reason, it's more special to me. And so the things that I care about the most are the things that Hollywood least wants to do, which is original genre material that might be expensive, but no one's ever going to make it. I'll give you a good example, like The Hunger Games, right? If Suzanne Collins had written The Hunger Games as a spec script, I guarantee you no one's ever heard of The Hunger Games. No one makes that movie.
Yeah, sure.
But because she wrote it as a book, which sold a bajillion copies, Hollywood was lining up to make it, and big stars and big money and all this crazy shit. Wait, she's riding around in a fucking chariot and her dress is on fire, and there's a guy with blue hair, and these kids are murdering each other. Like, but that Hollywood would do it because they knew there was a market there.
Yeah.
Hollywood is an extremely risk-averse business. Yeah. But if you remove the risk, hey, 50 billion people bought the book, they're going to show up for the movie, then they will do it. But if it's like, who knows if anyone's going to show up, but it's a cool story, they ain't doing it.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've learned... What's that?
Except for A24. They'll do it.
Except for, again, much smaller movies, less exposure to risk, right? The more money you're asking a studio to put on the table, the lesser their tolerance towards risk becomes.
And sci-fi is probably pretty expensive.
Right, and that's why the high end of the market is dominated by Star Wars and Marvel and Harry Potter and all the rest of it, because they know there's an audience there. Or S-tier filmmakers like Christopher Nolan, where he's the reason to go see it, right? That's Christopher Nolan himself is the brand.
I will see any
one of the last people left that can make big original movies, because he's Spielberg. Like, that's the reason to go, right? They are the franchise
they are the
themselves.
IP. Yeah.
They are the IP. I'm not at anything like that level, right? So a long time ago, I gave up writing. If I have an idea for like a bit, like, so Gundog's a great example. I'll pitch go type Gundog into your favorite podcast engine. It's very, very good. You'll enjoy it. It's got a big 60-foot tall mech in it. It's fun. I originally wanted to conceive that as a spec screenplay, as a live action feature film. But I've been doing this long enough to know and to anticipate all the reasons why Hollywood's going to say no.
So what you're talking about right now is the stuff that Save the Cat talks about.
Okay.
So, like, there's a lot of stuff in Save the Cat that does touch on the literal Save the Cat part, but and I don't think it's helpful to everybody, but, like, there's a part in it that it's like, if you want to make money, write a Christmas movie. they're so safe for studios, and it does have some stuff about
yeah,
pitching
and residuals every year, every Christmas
residuals,
forever. I
yeah.
have 3 Christmas movies in development right now because I want to be Hugh Grant
like a good
in About
idea.
a Boy who's just living off Christmas residuals forever and never has to work again.
Yeah.
But no, so I did this. So several years ago, I had an idea for like this medieval horror fantasy thing called Abomination. But I know for a fact I can visualize it right now. I'm in a room at Paramount or Fox or wherever, and I've got my little bottled water, and we've done our small talk, and they'll go like, "Okay, what have you got for us today, Gary?" Okay, it's 10th century England, and I can see the fucking executives switch off right away. Like, we're not making
already
this.
expensive.
But I've got to nod politely for the next 15 minutes while this guy explains this movie that we're never going to make.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how good it is kind of the problem. You can write something incredible, but if it's not makeable,
if the algorithm says no,
yeah,
it's a no.
Yeah.
And period movies don't make money.
Yeah.
All right, or this is too expensive, or whatever it is. They've got all their reasons to say no. The default is always a no. The default, when you go into a Hollywood meeting like that, the default is not neutral. The default is a no.
Yeah.
And you have to turn it into a yes, which is that much harder. And I've been doing this long enough now to anticipate. I've heard every single reason possible why they passed on a pitch or a piece of material, and I've learned to anticipate it. And it's heartbreaking for me to spend 6 weeks to anywhere between 6 weeks and 6 months writing a spec screenplay that goes out to Hollywood. 15, 20 people read it. They all pass, and that's it. It's dead. I spent 6 months writing something that 20 fucking people in the world will ever read.
Yeah.
Right? And now it sits on a shelf, and it's done. I don't want to do that anymore. It's a waste of my time. I want my stories to find an audience, and I'm a screenwriter primarily. That's my first language, is film and television. But I just want to tell stories. And so I instead wrote Abomination as a novel, and that got published, and people liked it, and it found an audience. And so that's the end game. Good. But guess what? It's now also a piece of IP. Sure. Now, if they want to make a movie, they're adapting a book, and that's a different equation. So with Gundog, I did a similar thing. It's like, no one's going to make, like, to make the live action version of Gundog would be like $100 million, like 60-foot tall mech battling aliens in post-apocalyptic America. Very, very cool. But like, no one's going to make it.
Yeah.
Right.
Unless it's Godzilla.
Which again, why? Because everybody knows Godzilla, because it's a franchise. It's an IP. Every now and again, like sometimes it only takes like one Spielberg or Del Toro to find the script to go, I'm obsessed with this. And then it's getting made. But like, that's a lottery. You may as well buy a lottery ticket. And so rather than do that, I wrote it as a book, which again, I know I can get published. Even if I have to self-publish it, I know I can do it. I know I can find an audience. And so I wrote it. So Gundog, I wrote as a book. I produced my own audiobook adaptation of it during the pandemic. I called in some favors.
Very cool, by the way.
Thank you very much. So Shannon Woodward came in. Your friend and mine, Troy Baker, came in and did some voiceover. Your friend and mine, Austin Winfrey, wrote this beautiful soundtrack for it. And it ended up being this really successful thing. We haven't published an episode of Gundog since November. It finished in November. It is still the #2 most popular sci-fi podcast in America.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's mental.
Damn.
And so now what's happened is, aside from the creative satisfaction of me knowing that the story found an audience and was well liked, now when we go to Netflix, Disney, HBO, Amazon, Apple, whoever, for the screen adaptation, I can say, hey, look, this isn't an original. It's based on this tremendously successful piece of IP. So creatively it works for me. I get to tell my story, and commercially it works because it's a different proposition for the studio.
Yeah.
So that, again, that's for example, that's an example of learning. Take what you can learn from failure. I got tired of writing spec scripts that no one was going to make. What can I learn from this? Well, Hollywood doesn't like making big, expensive, original science fiction films from a writer no one's ever fucking heard of.
Yeah.
Whether I've done a Star Wars movie or not, that really only takes you so far. And so let me find another way to do it. And
what you've done is figure it out rather than give up, is sort of the point. Like,
right.
And a lot of people would give up and be frustrated because, again, it's not necessarily about how good what you wrote is. It's about how makeable it is. It can
the
be,
quality
you can write
of the
something
material
incredible, it's irrelevant.
The quality of the material is important, but it's not the most important thing. What will ultimately get a studio to pull the trigger and write like $100 million check is there an audience for it?
Yeah.
Can we market it? How much is it gonna cost to make? Are we gonna make money? Basically, are we gonna make our money back?
Yeah.
And that's a different equation in the world of streaming, because when you release a movie at the box office, to make and market a movie costs a certain amount of money versus what it makes at the box office, and then ancillary, right? There's a number there that comes out. You either come out ahead or not.
Yeah.
But with streaming, it's obviously much more complicated, right? Because you don't know. You're just like, this movie on Netflix made this much money. That's not how it works.
No, apparently I was talking to somebody recently who's a producer, and they were saying that there currently just isn't enough data. Like, they don't even know how it works yet. There is just not enough data available for even the streaming services to know how that correlates yet.
And it is becoming more algorithm. I mean, it's fascinating that you say there isn't enough, because like one of the things that Netflix has, like I'll tell you this is my prediction. If Netflix is ever sold in the future down the road to like Apple or Amazon or one of the even bigger companies, the value of the greatest value of Netflix is not the library, although that, you know, their library of original content is now very impressive. It's not the number of subscribers they have, although that is also very impressive. It's that fucking database they have.
Yeah.
They know so much about their audience.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem with it is now, you know, we talk about like AI is going to come along and take all our jobs. And it is. I think writers have got probably about 3 to 5 years left. And so like make hay while the sun shines. But for right now, again, I don't know exactly how it works at Netflix or Apple or Amazon or all these kind of algorithmically, you know, led companies. But like it's no longer just done on like a creative executive's like gut instinct anymore. Like something gets fed into an algorithm and the computer says yes or no.
I changed the way I do all of my YouTube thumbnails because of Netflix. I was like, clearly they know how it works. Clearly they know what gets me. What do they do? And I looked at a bunch of Netflix thumbnails and was like, do that. So now it's just
did you know that
large
when
faces?
Oh yeah, you got to have faces. Did you know, by the way, that when you and I browse Netflix and we look at the same show, we don't necessarily get the same thumbnail?
Yes, because in my household, every time that we browse Netflix and there's anything that Rahul's in, we get Rahul's face.
Right.
All of them.
Right.
So like if you look at Bly Manor or Midnight Mass, some people will have like for Midnight Mass, they'll have like a church. We have a picture of Rahul every single time. And I don't imagine Netflix like been like, oh, well, Rahul Kohli uses this account. Let's give him his own face. I don't think that's what happened.
But let me give you another example. I'm not talking specifically about Netflix or any company in particular, but I know for a fact that this is a thing that happens now. Let's say, for example, that you in the past have watched a lot of romance movies, right? A lot of movies that have romantic content.
Definitely not, but yes.
And there's definitely not. No. Come on, are you not a romantic?
No, and it's the one thing I can't write. I've said this before on the show.
You don't like rom-coms or epic romances or anything? Let's say that you've watched a lot of action movies, right? And there's a new movie on Netflix or Amazon or Apple or whatever streaming service that is a combination of action, but there's also a lot of romance in it, right? I've watched a lot of romance movies. You are going to get a thumbnail that presents it as an action movie. I'm going to get one that presents it as a romance movie because it's bespoke marketing to each of us.
Yeah. And
these streaming services don't just know what movie you watched. They know exactly how much of it you watched. They know if you tapped out at like 16 minutes and 47 seconds into the movie, they know that. They know how long you lingered on a thumbnail before you moved on to the next one. That data is it's wealth. And whether or not it all adds up to something that actually makes sense, we don't know. But like this is where the business is going. It's being increasingly driven by data and this algorithmic
the whole world
stuff.
Is, Gary. Everything is, all of everything we do.
You can't change it. You just got to get right with it.
Or figure it out and then adapt to it. What are people looking at and what's that data and what do we make from that is an interesting one. I have to go now. Obviously, we could have done this for hours.
All day. I got to say, this is the most fun I've had in ages. I love talking to you about this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'll see you in a couple of weeks at DICE.
At DICE, I'm presenting 2 awards at DICE.
Oh, awesome.
Your game is nominated in both of the categories that I am presenting.
I am not presenting this year because my game is nominated for too many awards. That's what Megan said, and I was like, hey,
that's a champagne problem.
We'll take it. Thank you for that.
I was going through the nominations the other day. There's very few categories that your game isn't nominated, and those are the ones that just VR or whatever, things where it's not
family.
Even appropriate.
Yeah.
But art direction, animation, best game, design, story, character, music,
Santa
audio.
Monica Studio is incredible. I did not have any of it, but
I mean, my goodness, yeah, what a privilege it must be to work there.
It is. It's incredible, and I every day still feel like I should be paying them. I keep being like, I should be paying you to let me do this and not the other way around. It's very weird. Like when I got promoted, I was like, and you get a pay rise with a promotion. I was like, can I give you the money to keep me working here? This is crazy. It's a really wonderful place to work.
That's very cool.
But yes, I will see you at DICE. And for everybody who will not see the two of us at DICE, Gary, where can people find you and what are you working on right now?
You can find me on less so on Twitter because Twitter has gone in the fucking toilet and I don't really bother with it anymore. Yeah. What a mess. Have you ever seen a tech product go downhill so quickly? What a fucking disgrace. But I am on Twitter and it's just my name at Gary Whitta, GaRywhitta. and I'm also on Twitch and YouTube under the same name, just my full name. What am I working on right now? That's a whole other podcast. I got a lot of stuff that's happening in the near future, none of which I'm at liberty to talk about, but I would love to come back and talk to you again when some of that stuff is out there in the wild.
Be happy to
cool
have you.
Stuff.
Otherwise, of course, people can find you on Kind of Funny, where we used to do a podcast together.
And the Kind of Funny Xcast publishes every Wednesday, so it records Thursday morning now. Me, Mike, and Paris. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. We miss you over there. You were always great.
I'm always happy to stop by.
Come by next time you're up in the Bay Area. Come by and we'll get you in the studio.
I will actually be up the same week as Dice.
Have you been
to the
new studio yet? You got to go see it.
Yeah, I was going to ask
impressive.
if I can stop by. It looks awesome.
Oh yeah, they'll be thrilled to have you. They'll roll out the red carpet for you.
I definitely want to see it. It looks so cool, and such a credit to them that's what they did.
I'm so happy for Greg. I mean, you look at I was in their original little sad bedroom where they started, and look where he is now. It's amazing.
Yeah, and the fact that they did it without ever selling out to YouTube, I think, is the best part. Is I've said this about Kind of Funny before, and I'll say it again. Is the thing that I respect about them more than anything is they never folded to what's easy to get views on YouTube, which is negativity. When you're running a business and supporting people and hiring multiple people, I feel like I won't do that, but I'm just me and I have a job. When they're not doing that, they're not going for the negative clickbait stuff that's so easy to monetize on YouTube and grow an audience through, but they have to support humans as well. It's like it's really admirable.
That's just who they are. Like it's just it's positive. That's why I like it. Like there's so little positive energy these days.
Totally.
Especially on the internet. And again, I scroll through the same YouTube thumbnails as you, and I see all the grievance.
Yep.
And I see all the outrage, and I see all the clickbait, and it's so fucking depressing. And so I'm so glad that Kind of Funny have managed to make a success. They've proven that like positivity can still be
totally
attractive and lucrative.
Yeah, it's awesome. Shout out to them as well. But thank you for joining me, Gary. Thank you to everyone.
Happy to do it. Thanks so much.
We'll see you next time.
Bye bye.